The sun hung heavily over the square, baking the red earth until it shimmered. The villagers stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces drawn tight as the chief delivered his decree. His words were dry as dust, falling upon them like stones. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe too loudly. For laughter, the sound of joy, the rhythm of freedom, had been forbidden since the day the chief's heart turned to iron. Drummers no longer beat the talking drums. Even the birds seemed to have learned silence. The air was heavy with fear. But in the middle of the crowd stood Zobeida, a young woman with eyes that still carried sunlight. She had always been different, the one who sang to herself when she fetched water, the one who smiled at strangers, the one who dared to dream of mornings that didn't taste of sorrow. That day she listened to the chief's speech about obedience and punishment, his voice booming like thunder over dry fields. And something inside her, something wild, pure, and alive, broke free. At first, it was a small sound, a breath escaping her lips like a whisper of wind. But then it grew. Her shoulders shook, her chest trembled, and before she could stop herself, laughter burst out of her, clear, ringing, unstoppable. It rolled across the square like a river breaking through stone. The villagers gasped as one. Heads turned. Drummers froze mid-beat, though their hands no longer struck any drum. The chief's face twisted in disbelief. He raised his staff, carved with the faces of the ancestors, and slammed it to the ground. "Silence her," he bellowed. But Zobeida's laughter only grew louder, richer, deeper, like a song the earth had been waiting to hear again. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't cruel. It was simply free. It carried the memory of better times, of wedding dances, of children's games, of harvest songs beneath the moon. It was laughter that remembered what it meant to be human. The people wanted to look away but they couldn't. Her laughter stirred something long buried in them, the ache of joy they had forgotten, the longing for freedom they had smothered under fear. Some of the elders trembled, tears welling in their eyes. Others bit their lips, fighting the forbidden urge to smile. The chief's guards moved toward her, their spears glinting in the harsh light. Zobeida did not step back. "Do you mock me?" the chief roared, his voice echoing through the square. She wiped a tear from her eye, still laughing softly, her gaze steady on him. "No," she said between breaths. "I only remembered what joy sounds like." A murmur ran through the crowd. The chief's hand shook as he pointed his staff at her. "Bind her," he commanded. "Let her laughter be the last sound she ever makes." The guards hesitated. No one had dared laugh in years. To touch her felt like touching a curse or a blessing, no one could tell which. But the chief's glare burned hotter than the sun. They seized her arms and forced her to her knees. Dust clung to her face but she did not lower her head. "Do you repent?" the chief demanded. Zobeida smiled faintly, though her lips quivered. "For what?" she asked. "For remembering how to be alive?" A gasp rippled through the crowd again. One of the guards looked away, unable to meet her eyes. The chief raised his hand, and the sacred chains of silence, forged by the blacksmith long ago to punish those who spoke against authority, were brought out. The sound of metal rang across the square like thunder over graves. Before they fastened them around her wrists, she looked out over the people, scanning faces she had known since childhood. Women who once sang as they pounded grain, men who once laughed by the fireside. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met hers. Something flickered there, a memory, a spark, a question. As the first chain locked in place, her laughter finally faded, not out of fear but because it had done what it came to do. It had reminded them that silence was not peace, it was imprisonment. The chief stepped forward, towering over her. "From this day," he said, his tone sharp and final, "this one shall be known as the Fool of the Square. She shall wear her laughter in chains." The crowd stood still, the air heavy again. Yet beneath that silence, something had changed. The wind shifted. The trees at the edge of the village rustled softly as if whispering her name. Zobeida's eyes gleamed with quiet fire as the chains tightened around her wrists. Even as she was dragged away, her smile lingered, faint but unbroken. The guards moved through the crowd like shadows, their armor rattling faintly against the quiet air. The villagers parted in silence, creating a narrow path through the square. Every eye followed as they approached Zobeida, the woman whose laughter had cracked the stillness of the land. Her smile had faded now, but the echo of her laughter still seemed to hang above them, unsettling as thunder before rain. "Take her," the chief barked, his voice trembling between fury and fear. Two guards stepped forward, their grips rough as they seized Zobeida by the arms. Her bangles clinked softly against their armor, a small, defiant sound. She did not resist, she only stood tall, her bare feet sinking slightly into the hot dust. The crowd watched, breaths held, as though any movement might summon the wrath of the gods. Somewhere in the back, an old woman began to murmur a prayer beneath her breath, though none could tell if it was for mercy or for courage. As they dragged her forward, the dust rose around them in slow spirals. People leaned closer, whispering to one another. "She's cursed," someone muttered. "No," another whispered back, "she's blessed, and that's what frightens them." Children clung to their mothers' skirts, their wide eyes reflecting the glint of the sun on the guards' spears. At the edge of the square stood an old iron chest, locked and buried for years beneath the chief's hut. From it they withdrew the ancient chains, heavy, blackened with age, said to carry the silence of those who had worn them before. They had been made for thieves, murderers, and traitors, forged by a blacksmith who had never laughed again after their creation. When the guards lifted the chains, they clanged like struck bells, the sound sharp enough to make even the chief flinch. Zobaida's gaze followed the movement of the metal. She saw how the sun glinted off each link, and for a strange, brief moment she thought they looked almost alive, like serpents trying to remember freedom. The guards hesitated before binding her. The first man's hand shook slightly as he touched the iron to her wrist. The metal was colder than it should have been, cold even under the blazing heat of midday. When the first shackle closed, the ground beneath them seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that neither wind nor drum could explain. A murmur passed through the people. The second guard faltered, but the chief's glare cut through his hesitation. He forced the other shackle closed. A strange thing happened then, the chains trembled. It wasn't a trick of the eye or a gust of wind. The metal itself quivered as if recoiling from her skin. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. One even took a small step back, muttering something about spirits. But the chief only slammed his staff against the earth. "Bind her tighter," he ordered. Zobaida looked up at him then, not with anger but with something deeper, quieter. "You can bind my wrists," she said softly, her voice carrying farther than it should have. "But you cannot bind laughter. It travels where fear cannot follow." The villagers stirred. A few turned their faces away, afraid of meeting her eyes. The guards yanked the chain between her wrists, pulling her forward. Her ankles stumbled in the dust, but she did not fall. The more they dragged her, the more the chains trembled, their links rattling with an eerie rhythm that sounded almost like distant chuckling. The whispers grew. "Did you see that? The chains, they're shaking." "It's the spirits of joy," one woman hissed. "They've woken up." The chief's expression hardened, but the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed him. He waved his hand, and the guards began pulling Zobaida through the square toward the village prison, a small clay hut built near the edge of the riverbank. Her footprints marked the earth behind her, twin trails winding through the dust like the lines of a story being written. The people followed at a distance. Some cursed her name under their breath, fearful of being seen as sympathizers. Others watched silently, eyes shining with hidden hope. As she passed the old baobab tree, its leaves rustled even though there was no wind. A few of the elders exchanged glances, the kind that spoke of stories too dangerous to tell aloud. By the time they reached the prison gate, the sun had begun to sink. The chains no longer looked heavy, they looked restless. Zobaida stood at the entrance, her wrists still bound but her chin lifted high. Her laughter was gone, yet something of it lingered in her expression, a glint of defiance that no chain could crush. When the guards pushed her inside, one of them whispered to the other, "Did you feel that? The trembling?" He nodded. Like the chains were breathing. And outside, the wind stirred again, faint but unmistakable, carrying with it the softest echo of a laugh. They threw Zobaida into the hut like a sack of grain, and the door slammed shut behind her with a hollow thud that swallowed the last traces of daylight. The air inside was thick, old dust, damp earth, and the faint metallic scent of rusted chains. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. For a long while, she could see nothing, only feel, the cold floor beneath her palms, the bite of the iron still clamped around her wrists, and the heavy silence pressing in from all sides. It was a silence unlike any she had known before. Not the quiet of night, when the crickets sing and the trees murmur. This was a silence that felt alive, breathing in rhythm with her fear. She sat up slowly, her back brushing against the rough clay wall, and the movement sent the chains clinking faintly. The sound was small but sharp, echoing strangely through the small space. Then she heard it. A sound, faint, distant, like a memory, laughter. Her laughter. It bounced off the walls in a strange rhythm, not mocking but haunting. It was as if the very air remembered her joy and refused to let it fade. Zubaida froze, her breath caught in her throat. The laughter grew softer, fading into whispers, and then silence returned, heavier than before. She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against her knees. "Am I losing my mind?" she whispered to herself. Her voice came back to her, warped and hollow, but threaded with the faintest trace of that same laughter, echoing back from the walls like an answer. Hours passed, or maybe days, she lost count. The only way she measured time was by the cold creeping deeper into her bones and the moments when the moonlight slid through the cracks in the wooden door. Sometimes, when the moonlight hit the metal links around her wrists, the chains shimmered faintly as if reflecting something that wasn't there. Each night, she would hear it again, her laughter, soft and distant at first, then circling her like a slow dance. The first time it frightened her. The second time it puzzled her. But by the third night she began to listen closely. It was not laughter meant to mock or taunt. It sounded warm, familiar, the sound of her younger self, of freedom, of stories told by the fire before the village forgot how to smile. The chains would tremble when the laughter came. The iron links vibrated softly, humming as though trying to speak. She lifted her wrists and watched in the pale moonlight as they quivered. "Do you hear it too?" she whispered to them, and for a brief moment she thought she felt a pulse in the metal, faint like a heartbeat. Outside, the guards never stayed long by her door. They said strange things happened when the night deepened. Whispers from inside, lights flickering under the cracks, and the sound of laughter rolling like waves. Some claimed it was madness. Others swore it was spirits. But none dared open the door. Zubaida, in the darkness, began to understand. The laughter was not madness, it was memory. It was the sound of truth that no decree could silence. Every time her laughter echoed through the cell, the chains grew weaker, the silence cracked a little more. By the fifth night, when she placed her head against the cold wall, she heard not just her own laughter, but others, faint voices of women, laughing softly, as though sharing a secret she was finally ready to hear. Zubaida smiled in the dark. "If laughter is a crime," she whispered, "then let the walls be my witnesses." And as she drifted into uneasy sleep, the faintest sound of laughter rippled through the night again, not just from her but from the earth itself, echoing back from somewhere beyond the walls, refusing to die. The door creaked open one night, long after the guards had fallen asleep at their posts, lulled by the cool breath of the midnight wind. The faint flicker of a lantern appeared in the gap, trembling like a heartbeat. Zubaida sat upright, her chains rattling softly. A figure slipped through the door, hunched and wrapped in a robe the color of river mud. His steps were careful, his breath labored, and yet his eyes glowed with something that was neither fear nor age but memory. It was old Baba Chuma, the village storyteller, the man who had not spoken in years since the decree of silence had been passed. They said he once carried laughter in his voice like a drumbeat that healed hearts. Now his beard had turned silver, and his spine curved like a question mark left unanswered. He looked around the cell, his face tightening with grief when he saw Zubaida bound in chains. "Child," he whispered, his voice rasping like dry leaves. "Do you know what you've done?" Zubaida blinked in confusion, the dim light catching her face. "I laughed," she said softly. "I couldn't stop myself." The old man smiled faintly, lowering himself to sit beside her. "Then you have done what the world forgot how to do." For a long while he said nothing. The chains between them clinked faintly as he set the lantern down. The golden light spread across the floor, catching the glint of her manacles and the shimmer of her dark eyes. Baba Chuma took a deep breath, and in a voice that trembled like wind through reeds, he began to tell a story. There was once a spirit born from the first laugh of the first child. It danced through the world, bright and wild, lighting fires of joy in every heart. Wherever it went, flowers bloomed, rains came, and even the sick found strength again. It was called the Spirit of Joy, and it lived wherever laughter was shared. Zubaida leaned forward, listening as though her heartbeat had found its rhythm in his words. But one day, Baba Chuma continued, men grew proud. A king declared that laughter was weakness, that those who laughed were cursed. He built courts of silence, prisons of fear. The Spirit of Joy was driven from the land. Yet before it left, it whispered a promise. Those who silence laughter will one day hear the chains they forge laughing back at them. The wind sighed through the cracks in the cell as if listening. The Spirit hid itself, he said, inside the hearts of those brave enough to laugh even in sorrow, to remind the world that joy cannot be chained. When you laughed before the chief child, you did not break a law, you broke a curse. Zubaida's breath caught in her throat. Then why am I still chained? She asked, her voice small but steady. Baba Chuma's eyes softened. Because spirits test courage. Joy is not freedom given, it is freedom earned. Those chains will not hold you long. But beware, my child, when laughter returns, those who caged it will face its echo. And echoes, he said, tapping his chest, do not die quietly. He leaned closer, his old eyes shimmering in the lamplight. Listen to the wind, Zobeida. If it ever sounds like laughter, it means the spirit of joy walks again. Outside, thunder murmured far in the distance. The old man stood, his movements slow but sure. He touched the chains around her wrists, and for a brief moment she felt warmth pulse through the cold iron. Tell the world again how to laugh, he whispered. Even if it costs you everything. Then, before dawn's first light, Baba Chuma slipped out of the cell as quietly as he had entered. The door creaked shut behind him and silence settled once more, but it was no longer heavy. Zobeida sat alone in the dim glow of the dying lantern. Her wrists ached, yet her heart felt lighter, alive. The words of the elder lingered in the air like incense. The spirit of joy cannot be bound. As she closed her eyes, she thought she heard it again. Faint laughter, gentle as a mother's hum, rippling through the darkness. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the first bird of morning cried, its song carrying the promise of something that no decree could destroy. That night, the wind returned, not as a whisper of air but as something alive. It slipped through the cracks in the cell walls and brushed against Zobeida's cheek like the touch of unseen fingers. The torch outside had long since burned out, and the guards had drifted into uneasy sleep. Yet within that darkness something stirred, soft, rhythmic, almost melodic. At first she thought it was her imagination. But then she heard it clearly, laughter. Faint, layered, and distant, carried upon the wind like a memory that refused to fade. It wasn't cruel laughter, it was deep, rich, and full of life, echoing from places beyond her understanding. Zobeida's breath caught in her chest as she turned her head toward the barred window. The night beyond shimmered faintly, as though the stars themselves were leaning closer to listen. The laughter grew stronger, not one voice but many. Women's voices. They rose and fell together like waves against the shore, weaving a sound that was both haunting and beautiful. Zobeida pressed her hand to her chest and felt warmth spread beneath her skin, pulsing like the beat of a drum. Her heart thudded louder, keeping time with the voices that called through the air. Do not fear, one voice murmured through the wind. Your laughter woke us. Your courage has broken the silence, said another. Zobeida's chains rattled softly as she sat up, her eyes shining in the dimness. The air had grown thick with the scent of earth after rain, though no rain had fallen. She closed her eyes and let the wind wrap around her, carrying whispers of comfort, of pain, of defiance. The voices spoke of women who had been silenced, accused, or forgotten, their laughter buried under the weight of judgment. Now their joy had returned, fierce, unstoppable, echoing through her veins. Tears rolled down Zobeida's cheeks, but she smiled. For the first time since her arrest, she didn't feel alone. The wind hummed through the chains around her wrists, making them vibrate softly, almost as if they were laughing with her. She whispered into the darkness, I will not break. The wind answered with a gentle rustle, curling around her hair and lifting it slightly as if in agreement. The voices faded slowly, leaving only the faintest trace of laughter echoing through the night. Zobeida lay back against the wall, her spirit burning quietly like an ember that refused to die. The silence that followed was no longer heavy, it was waiting. The chains around her wrists felt lighter, not because they had loosened, but because something within her had grown stronger. As the moon slipped behind a cloud and the night deepened, she closed her eyes once more. The whispers had faded, but their meaning lingered in her chest. Laughter was not weakness. It was remembrance. It was power. It was freedom waiting for its moment to rise. The night was heavy with the weight of secrets. The moon hung above the village like a silent witness, pale and watchful. Inside the hut where Zobeida was held, the air trembled with something unseen. Her body was weak from hunger, her wrists scarred by the bite of the chains, but her eyes burned with a light that refused to dim. The echoes of the old storyteller's words still lingered. Those who silence laughter summon the wrath of spirits. And tonight, those words seemed to hum through the earth beneath her. A cold wind slipped through the cracks of the wooden walls, swirling around her ankles like an unseen presence. The chains rattled softly as if stirred by invisible hands. Zobeida drew in a breath, her chest aching, and let out a small laugh, weak at first, uncertain but alive. The sound trembled through the room, dancing between the walls. It grew louder, warmer, fuller, a sound that no fear could strangle anymore. It wasn't just her laughter now, it was layered with others. Laughter that belonged to those who had come before her, women whose spirits had been buried beneath cruelty and silence. The walls seemed to pulse with sound. The chains around her wrists began to vibrate, each metal link quivering with strange energy. Zobeida closed her eyes and laughed again, louder this time. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not from pain but release, a sound that carried all the sorrow, strength, and rebellion buried in her heart. The sound rose higher, swirling like a storm within the small hut. The ground trembled and the chains shuddered violently. Then with a sudden crack they split open. One by one the iron restraints fell to the ground, their sound sharp and final. But they didn't fall silent. To her astonishment, the broken chains began to tremble again, clinking together as if alive. From them came a deep, echoing laugh, metallic, eerie but full of power. The laughter multiplied, bouncing off the walls, filling every corner of the hut, rolling out into the night like thunder. It was not cruel or mocking, it was triumphant. It was freedom itself finding its voice. Outside the villagers stirred. They awoke to the strange sound that rippled through the air, the sound of laughter where there should have been despair. Some rushed from their huts, their eyes wide with fear. The elders whispered of curses, of the spirits of wronged women rising to reclaim their dignity. The guards who had thrown Zobeida into the cell stumbled back, unable to approach. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with invisible life. Inside, Zobeida stood slowly, her shackles lying broken around her. Her once tattered clothes glowed faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the gaps in the roof. She looked at her wrists, now free, and smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that carried the weight of generations. The laughter of the chains still echoed, spreading farther, reaching the sleeping hearts of the village. From hut to hut, the sound traveled, slipping into the dreams of women who had been silenced, beaten, or forgotten. They stirred in their sleep, feeling something awaken deep within, courage, memory, defiance. The laughter became a song carried by the wind, a melody that refused to end. The spirits of joy, long suppressed, had returned, and they danced through the night air. Zobeida stepped toward the door. The wooden frame, once locked tight, creaked open on its own. The cold night greeted her not as a prisoner, but as a queen reborn. The stars shimmered above, bright and countless, as if bowing in recognition. Behind her, the chains continued to laugh, their sound rippling outward until even the hills seemed to answer back. And as she walked into the moonlight, the village listened, to the sound of one woman's laughter breaking every chain that had ever bound her kind. It was not just freedom that had been unleashed that night, it was remembrance. The earth itself seemed to whisper her name, carrying her laughter into eternity. The morning broke with no birdsong, only the eerie sound of laughter weaving through the dawn air. It came from every direction, from the huts, from the fields, from the earth itself. It was not human anymore, it was layered, ancient, powerful. The villagers stumbled from their homes, clutching their chests in fear and awe. The laughter carried stories, of pain endured, of voices silenced, and of justice that would no longer wait in shadows. At the center of the village, the great court stood beneath the wide branches of the ancestral tree. The chief sat on his carved wooden throne, his robes of authority draped across his shoulders. He was a man used to power, to silence, to obedience. But today his hands trembled. The ground beneath his feet quivered, and the throne itself began to shake. The laughter was inside the court now, echoing from the walls, curling around the air like invisible smoke. The villagers gathered outside the court, whispering prayers. The elders exchanged glances of dread. The chief raised his hand for silence, but his command was drowned by the rising laughter that answered him, mocking, echoing, and strangely familiar. Then from the center of the court the chains appeared. They slithered across the floor like living serpents, the same chains that had once bound Zobeida. Their broken links clinked together, moving with purpose, gleaming faintly with moonlight that had not yet faded. Gasps filled the air as the chains began to twist and coil before the chief's throne. They rose upright as if invisible hands held them and then began to move. Slowly, eerily, they mimicked the gestures of command, the same motions the chief had used to order punishment, to silence laughter, to demand obedience. The villagers watched in stunned silence. Every cruel gesture, every raised hand, every signal of judgment that had once sentenced an innocent, the chains replayed them with precision. When the chief had pointed to a woman to be beaten, the chains pointed too. When he had struck the air in rage, they struck back, slamming against the wooden floor with a deafening clang. Each sound was an accusation. Each echo was truth returning to demand reckoning. The chief rose to his feet, shouting, "Stop this madness." His voice cracked, fear creeping into every syllable. He tried to move toward the chains, but they responded with a shrill metallic laugh that cut through the air like lightning. The throne behind him trembled violently and cracked down the middle, splitting the carved figure of the ancestor whose blessing once protected the rulers. "Spirit of laughter, be gone," the chief shouted, his authority dissolving in the chaos. But the laughter grew louder, stronger. It filled the court, bouncing off the pillars, circling him. It was no longer just the laughter of the chains, it was Zobaida's laughter, joined by the voices of countless others. The women who had been silenced now spoke through sound. The air itself trembled with their joy and vengeance entwined. Then through the broken door of the court, Zobaida stepped in. The villagers gasped. She was radiant, her clothes torn but her presence regal, her eyes steady as the earth. The laughter softened for a moment as if bowing to her. She looked at the chief, the man who had thrown her into darkness, and said nothing. Her silence was heavier than any curse. The chains rose beside her, coiling protectively at her feet like guardians. The chief fell to his knees. "Spare me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I did what the laws demanded." Zobaida tilted her head, her eyes glinting with something ancient. Mercy or judgment, none could tell. She smiled, not cruelly, but with the calm of someone who had already forgiven what the spirits had not. The laughter flared again, sweeping through the court, shaking every wall until dust rained from the roof beams. The throne collapsed completely, turning to splinters. Outside, the villagers knelt, tears on their faces. They knew what this meant. The days of silence were over. The voices once buried had risen. And when the laughter finally faded, the chief's throne lay in ruins, the chains lay still, and Zobaida stood tall in the center, not as a prisoner but as judgment made flesh. The chief stumbled forward, clutching at his chest as the laughter grew unbearable. It filled the air like a storm, rising and falling in waves of sound that made the walls tremble. His voice, once thunderous, now cracked and thin, broke through the noise in desperate pleas. "Please, make it stop," he cried, his knees buckling beneath the weight of his fear. His guards, who once obeyed him without question, stood frozen at the edge of the courtyard, their eyes wide with dread. No one dared move. The laughter no longer came from any single mouth. It came from everywhere, from the sky, from the ground, from the air that seemed alive with joy and vengeance. Then through the swirling dust and sound, Zobaida appeared. The first rays of dawn slipped through the open roof of the court, casting her in golden light. Her steps were slow, deliberate, every movement calm and filled with power. The villagers gasped. She was free, utterly free. Her wrists, once scarred from iron, shimmered faintly as if kissed by light. Around her feet, the broken chains slithered forward, not as shackles but as loyal companions. They coiled and rested beside her like serpents tamed by her spirit, gleaming with a strange, peaceful glow. Zobaida's eyes met the chief's. There was no anger there, only quiet certainty, the kind that makes even the proudest man tremble. The chief tried to speak, his lips trembling, but no sound came out. He fell to his knees, head bowed, tears cutting through the dust on his face. "Please, enough," he whispered hoarsely. "Take the laughter away. I cannot bear it." Zobaida looked around the square, at the villagers who had watched her humiliation, who had been too afraid to speak, too afraid to laugh. She saw guilt and shame reflected in every pair of eyes. Yet, beneath that shame she saw something else awakening, hope. The laughter, once haunting, had become cleansing. It was no longer cruel. It was pure and bright, like rain after a long drought. Zobaida raised her hands slowly. The laughter softened, turning from thunder to melody. The chains beside her pulsed once as if breathing, then settled completely. Silence fell, but it was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of relief, of something broken finally mended. The chief lifted his head, tears streaming freely now. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zobaida smiled faintly. "I am the voice you tried to silence," she said softly. "The laughter you buried, the joy you feared. I am what cannot be chained." The words struck like a blessing and a warning all at once. Around her, the air shimmered, and the faint hum of laughter lingered like wind through leaves, gentle, eternal. The chief bowed his head low, pressing his forehead to the earth, too ashamed to meet her gaze. "Forgive me," he murmured. Zobaida looked at him for a long moment, then turned her face to the rising sun. "The spirits will decide," she said, her tone calm and final. The villagers slowly fell to their knees, not out of fear but reverence. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, smiling shyly. The chains gleamed one last time, then dissolved into light, scattering across the courtyard like dust returning to the sky. And as Zobeida stepped forward into the sunlight, her laughter, free, radiant and whole, rose once more. But this time it was not defiance. It was renewal. The sound that had once condemned her now healed the village. The reign of fear had fallen, and in its place grew the power of joy unbound. Morning came to the village like a song long forgotten. The air was alive again, bright with sound and light. Where silence once ruled like a cruel king, laughter now danced through every street, soft and golden as the dawn. Children ran barefoot through the dust, chasing each other with joy bubbling from their throats. Their giggles echoed between the huts, rolling like waves, filling every corner that had once known only fear. Women gathered at the grinding stones, their voices rising in old songs that had not been sung for years. The sound of pestles striking rhythm matched their rhythm of joy. Their laughter came easily now, not the careful whispered kind that used to escape only when no one was watching, but full and open, like rivers breaking free from drought. The aroma of morning porridge mixed with the hum of voices, the village alive again as if it had been reborn overnight. Men too, who had once carried the weight of fear in their shoulders, now stood taller. They smiled without shame, greeting one another with warmth and relief. The silence that had chained their spirits was gone. The marketplace began to fill again. Drums returned, flutes were played, and the sound of commerce and cheer replaced the whisper of caution. Even the animals seemed lighter, the goats leaping, the birds singing louder from the trees. At the center of the square, the old decree stood nailed to a wooden post, the one that had forbidden laughter, declaring it an act of disrespect, of rebellion. For years, it had loomed over the people like a curse, a reminder that joy was dangerous. But now it was nothing but paper and ink, a fragile ghost of a past that no longer ruled. The people gathered around it as the sun climbed higher, their faces glowing with anticipation. Zobeida stood before them, her hair loose and bright in the morning light. The villagers watched her with reverence as if she were both woman and spirit, the one who had freed their voices. Beside her stood the old chief, humbled and aged overnight by guilt and revelation. He held a burning torch in his trembling hand. For a long moment there was silence, not of fear but of waiting. The chief looked at Zobeida and she nodded once, her smile calm but firm. Without a word, he stepped forward and touched the torch to the decree. The dry parchment caught fire instantly, the flames leaping upward in a sudden roar. The crowd gasped as the decree curled and blackened, its hateful words vanishing in smoke. The fire consumed it quickly, leaving only ash that rose into the air like dust of old sorrow. Then from somewhere in the back of the crowd, a child began to laugh, a small bright sound that cut through the morning. Others joined in. Within moments the whole village was laughing together, freely, fearlessly. The laughter wasn't cruel or mocking, it was healing. It was a sound that carried forgiveness, joy and freedom all at once. The earth seemed to hum with it, the trees swayed as if in rhythm, and even the river nearby shimmered under the sunlight, as though it too was smiling. Zobeida closed her eyes and lifted her face to the sun. The warmth touched her cheeks and for the first time in years she felt peace, not just for herself but for everyone who had been silenced. Around her the villagers began to dance. Old drums were brought out, the skins tightened and struck in celebration. Women clapped their hands, men stomped their feet. The chief fell to his knees before the fire's remains, tears rolling freely down his face. "The chains were never only iron," he whispered. "They were the silence we kept." Zobeida looked down at him and nodded gently. "Then let the silence stay buried," she said. And so it was. That day became known as the dawn of joy. Every year afterward, the villagers gathered at sunrise to laugh together, not to mock or boast but to honor what had been reclaimed. The sound of that laughter carried through the hills, through the river valleys, through generations. It was a reminder that joy is a form of courage, and that no decree, no fear, no power can truly silence a heart that dares to laugh. The sun rose higher, bright and golden, casting long shadows that danced across the earth. In those shadows freedom lived, alive, unchained and forever laughing. Years passed and the story of Zobeida became part of the wind itself. It was whispered through the fields of millet and echoed in the laughter of children splashing in the river. Her name traveled far beyond the boundaries of her village, carried by wandering traders, storytellers and old women who sang to the moon. They said that once, in a land ruled by silence, a woman's laughter had broken the chains of fear, and that laughter had never stopped echoing. Travelers who passed through the village swore they could still hear something strange when they laughed, a faint chiming sound, soft and golden, like metal singing. Some said it was the wind brushing against the trees, Others insisted it was the sound of the very chains that once bound Zobeida, now alive with joy, forever clinking to the rhythm of freedom. Over time her village transformed. What was once a place of rules and decrees became a place of festivals and songs. The old courtyard, where Zobeida had once been chained, was rebuilt into a gathering square. A large drum stood there, carved with the image of a laughing woman and chains curling like vines around her feet. Whenever there was a wedding, a birth, or even just a day of rain after drought, the villagers would gather and strike the drum 3 times, each beat calling upon her spirit to bless them with laughter. Elders told the young ones, "When you laugh, do not hold back. Laughter is sacred. It feeds the sky." And children, their faces bright with innocence, would ask, "But why do the chains laugh too?" The elders would smile and say, "Because even the things that once hurt us remember how it feels to be free." Years later, people from distant lands began to visit the village. They came to see the place of laughing chains. Some came with skepticism, expecting only a story. But when night fell and the villagers gathered by the fire to sing the song of joy, they often felt a strange vibration under the earth, like something humming along with them. The laughter that rose into the night sky seemed to shimmer, and faintly in the spaces between breaths, came the soft metallic music of the past. One traveler, a scholar from across the desert, wrote in his journal, "In this village joy has sound. I heard laughter and behind it something shining, a song of chains that were once heavy but now ring like bells of celebration. If spirits exist, they do not weep here. They laugh." The villagers kept the memory alive through generations. Zobeida's descendants, proud and kind-hearted, became known as the keepers of the echo. They watched over the drum and told the story every year during the Festival of Dawn. At sunrise they would light fires along the river and release small clay vessels filled with incense, letting the smoke rise toward the sky. One of Zobeida's great-granddaughters, a girl named Lami, inherited her laughter. It was said to be the same, strong, bright, unstoppable. When Lami laughed, birds flew from the trees, and even the river seemed to ripple in rhythm. But unlike Zobeida, Lami was never silenced. She lived in a village where joy was no longer rebellion but reverence, a reminder that courage could outlive the body. Still, sometimes in the quiet after the festival, Lami would walk alone to the old well where the chains were once broken. The stones were covered in moss now, the ground softened by time. She would sit there, her fingers tracing the carvings of her ancestor's name, and she would whisper, "Grandmother, do you still laugh?" The wind would rise softly, circling her like a dance. And in that wind she would hear it, faint but clear, the sound of golden links jingling in rhythm like laughter turned to music. Legends spread even farther. Across rivers and mountains, people began to speak of Zobeida the Unbroken, the woman who laughed in chains. Some claimed her laughter had reached the heavens and made the stars tremble. Others said she was a spirit now, wandering through villages to awaken joy in the hearts of those who had forgotten it. In one village, when a drought struck and people began to despair, an old woman stood up and told her grandchildren, "Do not fear the silence. It is only waiting for laughter to fill it again." They laughed that night, softly at first, then louder, and when they did, rain began to fall. The children shouted, "Zobeida heard us," and the story grew anew. Generations turned into centuries. Empires rose and fell, the world changed, but the story endured. It became a proverb in many tongues. Chains cannot bind laughter, they can only learn to sing. In art and song she was remembered not as a victim but as a flame. Pain had once silenced her, but her spirit had turned that silence into sound. Every village square where laughter echoed was said to awaken her blessing. Some even said that if you stood in Zobeida's village during a full moon and laughed with a true heart, your laughter would come back to you, not as an echo but as a chorus, as if thousands of unseen spirits were laughing with you. One night, a group of travelers camped near the river. They sat around a fire, telling stories. One of them, a young man who had never believed in such tales, asked the elder among them, "Do you truly think laughter can change the world?" The old man gazed at the water, reflecting the stars. "It already did," he said. "A woman once proved that laughter was stronger than fear. Her joy was not rebellion, it was truth. The world may forget her name, but every time someone laughs after pain, she is there." The fire crackled softly, and as the night deepened, the young man began to hear something faint, a sound like metal chiming in rhythm with the wind. He smiled, and though he did not admit it, he knew then that the old man's story was real. And so the legend continued, not as a tale of punishment or magic, but as a reminder that freedom often begins with the smallest act of defiance. A smile, a laugh, a refusal to let cruelty define you. They say that when laughter fills the air, even today you can still hear it, the faint sound of golden chains jingling, a melody of freedom that belongs to no one and to everyone. Some claim to see glimmers in the sunlight, as though invisible links dance where joy is strongest. Zubaydah's laughter has never died. It lives in children who giggle without fear, in mothers who sing while they work, in men who share jokes by the fire after long days. It lives in every heart that dares to be joyful in a world that sometimes forgets how. And when the wind passes through the village at night, carrying the scent of smoke and earth, it hums a quiet tune, the sound of chains that learn to laugh. The elders call it the eternal echo, the spirit of laughter that freed a people, the promise that joy, once awakened, will never again be silenced.